For individual assessees, between the income 2.5 lakhs to 5 lakhs to 5% instead of the present rate of 10%. I propose to allow a carry forward of MAT for a period of 15 years. No transaction above rupees 3 lakhs should be permitted in cash. Fiscal deficit for 2017-18 at 3.2% of the GDP. Affordable housing will now be given infrastructure status. We propose to create an integrated public sector oil major. We have therefore decided to abolish the FIPB, IRCTC, IRFC, and IRCON would be listed on various stock exchanges. Maximum amount of cash donation that a political party can receive will be 2,000 from any one source.
Hello and welcome. You're watching a CNBC TV 18 special continuing coverage on the Union Budget 2017. Let's take a look at the top budget headlines. Finance Minister presents a no-shock budget. Primary focus is on affordable housing, poverty elevation, infrastructure and rural development. Capital expenditure outlay hiked by 24%. Budget 2017 pegs fiscal deficit for FY18 at 3.2% of GDP, targets a fiscal deficit of 3% for the next 10 years. Net borrowing plan kept below street expectations. Meanwhile, individual taxpayers get some relief. Finance Minister reduces the income tax rate on incomes between 2.5 and 5 lakh rupees to 5% from 10%, but incomes between 50 lakh rupees and 1 crore rupees to attract an additional surcharge of 10%. No corporate tax cut, yes, for large companies, but smaller companies with turnover below 50 crore rupees will now have to pay 25% tax instead of 30%. Minimum alternate tax stays, but carry forward raised to 15 years. No bad news is, of course, good news on the last street. Markets give a thumbs up to the budget. No long-term capital gains tax on equities and no tinkering of short-term capital gains tax. However, foreign portfolio investors exempted from indirect transfer provisions. Ease of doing business gets a leg up. The government decides to abolish the Foreign Investment Promotion Board, will further liberalize India's foreign direct investment policy at a later date. Government unveils a 72,000 crore rupee divestment roadmap, plans to list IRCTC and 2 other railway PSUs at a later date. Meanwhile, an oil behemoth could be in the making. The government has today proposed the merging of assets of various oil PSUs or public sector units to set up a globally competitive integrated PSU oil giant. However, Oil Minister clarifies that this is a business decision and it is up to the companies and the PSUs to decide on the timeline. Moving on, the affordable housing segment gets a big push as it is granted infrastructure status. Government promises to build new homes for 1 crore households by the year 2019. Now, the post-demonetization war on black money continues. The Finance Minister accepts the recommendation of the SIT on black money to limit any cash transactions to 3 lakh rupees. Now, political parties have gotten curbs on donations. The maximum cash donation any party can receive from any one source has now been capped at 2,000 rupees. But political parties can accept donations by checks or digital modes. RBI Act will now be amended to enable the issuance of electoral bonds for political funding. Well, those were the big budget headlines of the day. Let's now toss across to Shireen Bhan, who is bringing us all the big political voices from the national capital. Shireen, back to you.
Well, thanks very much. Yes, now on CNBC TV 18, it is time for the political point of view on Budget 2017. So far, you've heard the tax experts, you've heard economists, you've heard market participants, and you've heard industry. But what do political parties make of Budget 2017? Joining me on the show, Jai Panda of the Biju Janata Dal. Also shortly, I will be joined by the West Bengal Finance Minister Amit Mitra, Rajeev Gowda of the Congress Party, Yogendra Yadav of Swaraj Abhiyan. Also with us, NK Singh, the chairman of the FRBM committee. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the show. Jai Panda, let me start by asking you what you made of Budget 2017. As Harsh Goenka tweeted a short while ago, and I'll quote that tweet to you, in the dangle of conflicting priorities, the Kabil finance minister has not made it worse for the Rais and rewarded the poor. The country will rock on.
That's, I think, a very catchy tweet. I don't have a Bollywood metaphor like that, but let me say two things. Any budget will have good and bad, and the Biju Janata Dal President Naveen Patnaik has already expressed certain degree of concern that state allocations have not gone up as much as we had been hoping for. For example, the transfer to states has probably gone up only about 5–5.5%. Now, apart from echoing that, I think if we look at a larger picture, I personally am happy about a couple of things. The one item in the budget that is really encouraging to me is the steps taken about cleaning up political funding. This has been a pet passion of mine. I have been writing to the Election Commission, the Law Commission. I've been writing op-eds about this a lot. And the implementation of the Election Commission's recommendation to reduce the cap for anonymous donation from 20,000 rupees to 2,000 rupees will go a long way. And also the bonds that are being proposed. Now, these are first steps after many, many years of discussion that political funding needs to be cleaned up. I think they will not be enough by themselves, but they will go a long way to set the ball rolling about the reforms necessary in political funding. And besides that, I'm very happy about the corrections in the tax anomalies, particularly for the lowest level of salaried bracket and for MSMEs. These are two areas that I'd like to highlight.
Okay, two areas you'd like to highlight and one area of disappointment where you believe that state allocation should have been higher. Yogendra Yadav, let me come to you now, because as far as the theme or the approach of this budget is concerned, the big pillar has been development expenditure. If I were to just take a look at what these schemes or the expenditure on the rural economy is concerned, 1,87,000 crore rupees, that's 24% higher, specifically on schemes like the NREGS. It's a 10,000 increase over the previous year's allocation at 48,000 crores. Dairy processing, a fund of about 8,000 crore rupees with an initial corpus of 2,000. I mean, it's a long list, but some in substance meaningful or not?
It's a long list, Shireen, but what is the big picture? I've been trying to think about it since the morning. We had a Kisan Sansad, we had farmers from different parts of the country together, and we could not get one single big idea that would enthuse persons from agriculture, from rural India. You might think this is the usual duty, dharma of the opposition, but that's not the case, Shireen. This is one budget that farmers had truly pinned their hopes on. The idea was, and there was some kind of a rumor, sense, something in the air to say something big is going to be announced for the farmers. And there was none. None on pricing and income for farmers.
Yogendra,
nothing substantial
the target
on
is
reducing their...
Yeah, what is it that you exactly wanted where the budget has left you disappointed?
On agriculture, the 3 or 4 basic ideas were in the air, were to be discussed. One idea was some minimum income guarantee for farmers, or at least appointment of a farm income commission to begin with.
Okay.
2, something to tackle the debt trap and the debt burden of Indian farmers, at least to do away with the interest that they are saddled with. This is huge. This is what is leading to suicides all over the country. And third, some way of protecting them against the climate change induced vagaries, which is leading to huge disasters all over the country. There is none on all these 3
But there has been a provision or an enhancement of provision as far as the Fasal Bima Yojana is concerned, Yogendra.
I'm just coming to that. On Fasal Bima Yojana, the government claims, yes, we have spent more than twice as much as we had allocated. That's actually right. But what has gone up? Have more farmers benefited from it? The answer is earlier it used to be 21%, now it's 26%, only 5% increase. So much of expenditure. What has gone up? It is actually the profit of the insurance companies which has gone up. In the case of Manrega, why is it that we have a 10,000 crore rupees increase? Because the Supreme Court ordered them to do so. In the Manrega case that you are very well aware of, Shireen, the Supreme Court passed strictures and said you have to do it. So now they're making virtue out of a necessity of a Supreme Court order.
Okay,
so really,
I'll come back to you, Yogendra, but let me bring in you're saying no big ideas in this budget. Rajeev Gowda, as Yogendra said, I hope it's not going to be the dharma of political parties appearing on this program to criticize the budget. But give me specifics of where you believe this budget has fallen short of your expectations. The big theme was job creation. The big theme was revival of the rural economy. The big theme was capital expenditure, which is up 24% in this budget. Where would you criticize this budget?
Well, this budget is really in the wake of demonetization, and it's a damage control budget. If you look at the Manrega expenditure, it's aimed at providing relief to migrant workers who have rushed back from construction sites in urban India. If you look at MSMEs, only those who are registered will get the benefit. Even on Manrega, by the way, there is a 14,000 crore outlay backlog which needs to be cleared by the government. So these numbers are actually going to be quite misleading. And the other sector, of course, is the below 5 lakh sector. That's, we need to revive consumption in this country. So to that extent, this is going to be a marginal, have a marginal impact given inflation and things of that sort. The biggest crisis in our Congress Real State of the Economy report that we released 2 days ago, we highlighted jobs as the central problem facing the country. This government has seen a steady decline in new job creation, and it's going down further. The economic survey had some suggestions for the finance minister, saying focus on leather, apparel. Those are sectors which have a good job multiplier.
But those are sectors, Rajeev Gowda, were already, for instance, for the textile sector, 6,000 crore rupee package has already been announced. So the government is now betting perhaps on what they see as multiplier sectors, housing and construction and so on and so forth, to actually be able to provide some sort of a stimulus in the job market.
No, we needed much more imaginative, much more specific. I can't hear you too well, I'm afraid, but incentives for the sectors that drive job creation, that employ a large number of people, and that we've not seen in this budget.
So disappointment on job creation. Let me go across to NK Singh, the chairman of the FRBM panel, joining us here on the show. Mr. Singh, a tinge of disappointment perhaps that the recommendations of the FRBM committee that you chair have not been adopted yet. We perhaps will see them being adopted by the government. But on the fiscal deficit front, sir, your recommendation was 3%. They've deviated a tad at 3.2%. But given the context, do you believe that this is the need of the hour?
Well, I think let me say that I certainly had the privilege of chairing this FRBM committee, of which Arvind Subramaniam was also a member and has signed off on the report. Now, I think that one of the positive things which must be said is that this government has strongly believed in the continued path of fiscal consolidation. It was this government's time that fiscal rectitude was once again the centerpiece. Fiscal deficit has tended to come down, 3.5% in the current fiscal year. I would have preferred to take it to 3%. The finance minister has mentioned this, but he has given the reasons why he has really at the moment gone to 3.2 with a commitment to go to 3% next year, which is completely consistent with the recommendations of the FRBM committee. The finance minister has mentioned about the provisions in the escape clause, which is also contained in the FRBM committee's report, and that instead of resorting to that, he has done a more transparent and honest thing by saying that this year he'll go to 3.2%, we're going to 3%. But mind you, the centerpiece of the FRBM's recommendation is a paradigm shift of moving away from fiscal deficit as the principal macroeconomic anchor to debt as the principal economic anchor.
Yes.
This is in line with the best international practice. We had recommended 60% debt to GDP, 40% for the central government, 20% of the states, to be achieved by 2023, and we believe that the fiscal trajectory which we had recommended, and even the somewhat modified ones, considering that there is a commitment to come to 3% next year, will enable us to reach the optimum debt to GDP ratio for India by 2023. By the way, if the markets have given thumbs up to this budget, it is in no small measure a demonstration that they recognize this government's continued commitment to the key features of macroeconomic stability, which they regard and rating agencies regard as central to the way in which investors view India as an investment destination.
You're absolutely right on that front, sir, and the markets have given it a big thumbs up on account of that. But if I may just ask you about the concerns that could arise because of this business of having an escape clause as part of the recommendations that you've suggested, that were a government to deviate from the stated fiscal deficit target, the escape clause could be triggered. The government has categorically stated today that he's not the finance minister said he's not invoking the escape clause. But what could be the concerns that you may have with the possibility of deviation and the provisions that your recommendations have made?
It's a very loaded question, Shireen, considering that the report is not yet officially in public domain and the government has to take a decision on that one. But since one of the triggers of the escape clause has been mentioned in the finance minister's speech, I would be less than honest in not replying to you to say that there are 3 escape clauses which have been mentioned, one of which the finance minister has mentioned, namely that major structural reforms and changes with unanticipated revenue consequences. The other is a very sharp decline in GDP numbers, and that the third being acts of war, aggression, and a collapse of agriculture. Now, the concerns really are that these escape clauses must not ordinarily be used. There are certain conditions and institutional checks and balances which are contained in this report, the most important of which being a commitment to return to the path from where the deviation has taken place. Now, in all fairness, I must really compliment the finance minister that although he's deviating from the 3% recommendation to 3.2%, there is a commitment to come back to the original path of 3%, which he has undertaken upon himself, which is completely consistent with the committee's recommendation. And finally, let me say that this report is embedded with the features of the best international practice on what is described loosely as second-generation fiscal rules and norms.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that for us, even though the report is not public, Mr. Singh. But Jay Panda, you know, I think one of the big bets that the government is making is the rollout of the GST come the 1st of July. Not part of the budget speech, no assurance in that sense being given, but the finance minister and his officials stating that they would hope a 1st July rollout is possible. What does your gut tell you, given what we've seen now happen at the meetings of the GST Council?
Let me answer that, but very quickly I want to add something on the fiscal deficit. You know, I want to reiterate that the fiscal deficit is the single biggest factor when international rating agencies look at a country's sovereign rating. So when Standard & Poor's or Moody's looks at India's rating, this is the single most important thing. And I think you can call it as a glass half full or a glass half empty. Yes, they didn't go to the 3% that Mr. NK Singh had recommended, but please remember, they have steadily brought it down from an inherited 3.9% to 3.5% and now committing to 3.2% is a very, very clear roadmap of responsibility despite pressures of populism that were being fretted about. So I would see this as a glass half full because the trajectory is quite clear that it's on the way down. Now regarding GST, I also have been saying that this is the single biggest not just taxation reform, but the single biggest, I think, economic reform we have seen since 1947. And I think the FM gave a hint that most issues have been sorted out in the GST Council. But I worry about that last unsaid thing as to whether the last inch is going to get held up on political considerations. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed because it would be very bad for the country if it got delayed.
Well, we hope that that is not the case. But Yogendra Yadav, if I could ask you to put your political aspirations aside and speak purely as a psephologist, on the back of what you've heard today from the budget, we've got state elections coming up. You talked about, or Rajeev Gowda talked about how this was a damage control budget post-demonetization. Do you believe that this is going to fly? Is this going to reap dividends for the BJP in the state elections?
One thing we must say in all fairness, the ruling party has not tried to use this budget for taking an electoral advantage in any state. I think it cannot give them any advantage in 2007. I doubt if it can give them any advantage in 2019. I doubt if it can give them any political advantage at all. So I don't know, you don't have a BJP person in the panel, but if you were to switch off the camera and ask them, they would be terribly disappointed, BJP MPs, because what is the big thing that they want to take back to? Any politician wants to go back to their electorate and say, I brought this to you in the last 5 years. Now, in the last 3 years, we didn't see anything major as that. This is the one budget where you expected something big, because remember, this is the last budget which can hope to actually achieve consequences by the time they go to polls in 2019. Next year's budget would be a pre-poll budget, would be seen very differently. So honestly, there is no one big political idea that BJP would be able to take.
Well, at least as you acknowledge, Yogendra, to be fair, they haven't played the populist card. They haven't done what people were speculating about, which is throw in money into the Jan Dhan accounts and so on and so forth. So let's give credit where it's due, that the government has stuck to the path of not being fiscally profligate given the current circumstances and the speculation. But Rajeev Gowda, you know, if I could come to you now and ask all of you, in fact, Jay talked about that, but in terms of political funding, governance, cleaning up, you know, they've accepted the SIT's recommendation of doing away with cash transactions above 3 lakhs, specifically for political funding. I mean, we're now today talking about the possibility of electoral bonds. Is this not a big shift in governance?
Well, political funding reform is something that we are all very, very keen on. And I think a much larger debate needs to be engaged in across parties. And we need to come to the very specifics of we have to look at the realities. It is very costly to run a democracy. You need people who to be politicians full time. You need parties to function full time. You need money for campaigns and media and things like that. So there is, we need to find ways, including state funding. I've also written substantially about this, and those efforts are very, very crucial. But I'd like to just bring up 2 points here. One, in response to Mr. Singh, if you look at the fiscal responsibility efforts of this government, they have not been systemic. There are no systemic changes. The first year was a bonanza from selling Coal India and Spectrum. Last year it was the oil bonanza. This year that's going to come down. And these are all raised through excise duties on oil.
This year they're betting on a demonetization bonanza
and
a jump in direct taxes.
And the other point, one more point I want to make, because I don't have much time with you, is that there's a difference between the mega announcements that Mr. Jaitley makes and the government's ability to actually implement them. If you look at all these infrastructure projects that they've been talking about and the mega commitment in terms of investments announced, the actual delivery when it comes to how much has been done on Swachh Bharat, how much has been done on roads, how much has been done on,
on the road sector, there has been a significant outcome of the outlays. There is a valid point that you make, but at least not on the road sector, because the road sector actually has been one of the best performing sectors. But gentlemen, we're running out of time. Mr. Singh, I'll give you the final say on this panel before I wrap it up.
Thank you very much. Let me respond to you, Mr. Gaurav. I don't want to make a political point, but the fact remains that it is the NDA government which have consistently believed in fiscal legislation. For the first time, the existing FRBM Act was enacted in 2003 at the time of Mr. Vajpayee and the finance minister of that time, Mr. Yashwant Sinha. Thereafter, for a couple of years, it ran very well. And then, unfortunately, several things happened. A pause button was pressed in UPA 1. A huge stimulus was given thereafter. And fiscal deficit numbers ran up by 4 percentage points of GDP, which completely threw the roadmap. It was when the NDA government returned back that we began once again the exercise of fiscal rectitude. And it has to be given to their credit that this current FRBM committee, which has also laid out another fiscal roadmap in terms of a new legislation which embeds the fiscal policies in a debt anchor, is really the belief of the NDA government on following policies embedded in sensible macroeconomic policies contributing to long-term stability.
And I think that is what the markets liked, and that is, I think, what investors have also taken away as one of the big headlines from this budget. NK Singh, Panda Yogendra Yadav, Rajeev Gowda, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. I have to say it's actually been a very interesting, engaging political conversation. There's been no tutu meme and no trading of charges, and that's how we like it here on CNBC TV 18. Thank you very much for joining us here. We'll take a break, but when we return, the CBEC chief and the CBDT chief join us on CNBC TV 18 as our comprehensive coverage on the budget continues.